Begin with farmers slowly learning to work together. It started with survivors who already knew how. The first Sumerians did not invent cities. They remembered them. Before Mesopotamia rose, a whole world drowned, and the people who escaped carried knowledge so dangerous that history buried it deeper than the ocean ever could. The proof does not come from old legends or strange theories. It comes from the bottom of the North Sea. Before we follow this journey from a drowned world to the first cities, I'd love to know like this video and subscribe if you're drawn to stories where the ground beneath our feet hides secrets the history books forgot. And if you're still with me, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what hour keeps you company tonight. I want to imagine us spread across the same world that Doggerland's refugees once crossed, all of us searching for the same thing to understand what came before the beginning. Now let us begin. Between 10,000 and 6,000 BC, Northern Europe was not a scatter of islands like it is today. It was home to Doggerland, a landmass larger than modern Britain, stretching from Scotland to Denmark to the Netherlands. This was not barren tundra. Sediment cores pulled from beneath the North Sea revealed dense forests, wide rivers, seasonal lakes, and evidence of sophisticated human settlement. Tens of thousands of Mesolithic people lived there, hunting reindeer along migration routes, fishing with engineered traps, and gathering at communal sites that suggest complex social organization. Then the ice melted slowly. At first, sea levels rose year by year, decade by decade, swallowing the coasts and pushing populations inland. But Doggerland did not die quietly. Around 6200 BC, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, the Strega slide, triggered a mega tsunami. Waves up to 20 meters high slammed into what remained of Doggerland, flooding valleys, erasing settlements, and destroying a world that had stood for millennia. Archaeologists have mapped this destruction. Geologists have dated it. Paleoenvironmentalists have reconstructed it. But here is what they have not answered. Where did the survivors go? Because when you look at what happens next in the archaeological record, something strange begins to appear. Not in Northern Europe, where Doggerland once stood, but far to the southeast, in a region that would one day become the cradle of civilization. At the very moment Doggerland vanishes from history, the Fertile Crescent experiences a sudden influx of new settlers. Population models show unexplained surges. Tool traditions shift. Microlithic blade industries identical to those used in Northern Europe begin appearing in the Levant and Mesopotamia. Pottery styles echo Atlantic European motifs. Bone carvings carry symbolic marks previously seen only in Doggerland's cultural sphere. Mainstream archaeology treats these as coincidences, isolated innovations, parallel developments. But when you line up the dates, the picture changes. Doggerland drowns in 6200 BC. Within centuries, the Near East begins showing signs of displaced populations arriving from the northwest. Within a few thousand years, the world's first cities appear in Sumer. Not gradually, not experimentally, but suddenly, as if the knowledge to build them had come from somewhere else. Irrigation systems with no known prototypes. Urban planning that appears fully functional. Accounting methods that emerge in mature form. Astronomical alignment suggesting generations of skywatching. Writing systems that seem to skip all developmental stages. It's not that Sumer invented these things. It is that Sumer appears as if its builders already knew what they were doing. And then there is the genetic evidence. Studies of ancient DNA reveal something unexpected. Traces of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. Genetic signatures from Northern Europe appearing in early Near Eastern populations where they should not be. Those populations contributing to the first farmers. Anomalous genetic markers in the earliest Mesopotamian communities that do not fit local migration models. Someone from the northwest reached the Near East during the exact window when Doggerland was being destroyed. Before we trace that journey further, there is one more piece of the puzzle, and it comes not from the ground or the genome, but from the stories the Sumerians told themselves. They had a flood myth. You may have heard versions of it. Zaisudra, Adnapishtim, the boat that saved humanity, the knowledge preserved through catastrophe. For a long time, scholars assumed these were purely symbolic moral tales wrapped in cosmic language. But what if they were not symbols? What if they were memories? Because the Sumerian flood myth describes a world swallowed by water. It describes survivors fleeing by boat. It describes a remnant of people who carried the knowledge of the old world into the new. And it describes this catastrophe happening not in Mesopotamia, but somewhere far away at distant homeland now lost beneath the waves. Archaeology confirms that Doggerland drowned. Genetics confirms that Europeans reached Mesopotamia. Material culture confirms that northern tool traditions appeared in the Near East. And mythology confirms that the earliest Sumerians remembered a flood. The question is no longer whether displaced populations could have traveled from Doggerland to Mesopotamia. The question is, what did they bring with them? And if the first cities were not invented but rebuilt, then what world came before them? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, not to Sumer, but to the land that drowned. To understand what the Doggerland refugees might have carried with them, we first need to understand what Doggerland actually was. Not a mythical lost continent of fantasy, but a real, documented, thriving landscape that existed for thousands of years before the ocean erased it. Their reconstruction begins in the 1930s, when fishing trawlers working the Dogger Bank, a shallow ridge in the North Sea, began pulling up something unexpected. Tangled in their nets alongside modern fish came fossilized bones, mammoth tusks, reindeer antlers, and then tools, stone blades, barbed harpoon points, fragments of worked bone that could only have been shaped by human hands. What the fishermen had found was not debris from a shipwreck. It was evidence of a drowned world. Over the following decades, marine geologists mapped the seabed using sonar, seismic surveys, and sediment cores drilled deep into the ocean floor. What emerged was a landscape that had been hidden for 8,000 years. The North Sea, they discovered, had once been dry land, and not just land, but a vast fertile plain laced with rivers, dotted with lakes, covered in birch and pine forests, and home to one of the richest ecosystems in Mesolithic Europe. Doggerland stretched from the coast of Scotland, southward to the modern Netherlands, eastward to Denmark, and north toward Norway. At its peak, it covered an area larger than Britain itself. The Thames and the Rhine were not separate rivers flowing into the sea. They merged into a single massive waterway that wound through the heart of Doggerland, before emptying into the Atlantic far to the west. Pollen grains preserved in sediment layers tell us what grew there. Hazel, oak, alder, willow, grasses, and wetland plants clustered near the rivers. Open grassland stretched across the interior plains where herds of wild horses and orchards grazed. Along the coasts, salt marshes teemed with birds. And in the countless streams and estuaries, fish ran thick during spawning seasons. This was not a marginal environment where survival meant constant struggle. This was abundance. The people who lived there adapted to its rhythms with remarkable sophistication. Archaeological evidence, what little has been recovered from the seafloor, reveals a culture closely tuned to seasonal cycles. They built fish weirs, intricate wooden traps placed in tidal zones to capture migrating fish. They tracked reindeer herds across the plains, timing their movements to intercept animals at river crossings. They harvested shellfish from coastal beds, hunted waterfowl during nesting season, and gathered hazelnuts in the autumn, when the forests offered their richest yield. And they gathered at certain sites. Evidence suggests large groups came together seasonally, perhaps hundreds of people at a time. These were not permanent settlements in the way we think of villages, but communal meeting points where knowledge was shared, tools were traded, partnerships were formed, and stories were passed down. The same locations appear to have been used repeatedly over generations, suggesting deep cultural memory and continuity. Population estimates vary, but conservative models suggest Doggerland supported tens of thousands of people. Some researchers argue the number could have been far higher. What is certain is that this was not a sparse scattering of isolated bands. This was a cultural network, a web of interconnected communities who knew the land, knew each other, and had developed ways of life refined over thousands of years. But the ice was melting. At the end of the last ice age, vast glaciers covering Scandinavia and northern Britain began their slow retreat. Meltwater poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose steadily year after year, generation after generation. Coastlines shifted inward. River valleys flooded. The western edges of Doggerland were gradually submerged beneath shallow seas. The people adapted. They moved inland. They adjusted their routes, their settlements, their seasonal patterns. For thousands of years, they managed the slow encroachment of the water. The land shrank, but it remained until it didn't. Around 6200 BC, something happened that no amount of adaptation could survive. Off the coast of Norway, beneath the cold waters of the North Atlantic, a section of the continental shelf collapsed. The Storegga Slide, as geologists now call it, was one of the largest underwater landslides in known history. An estimated 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment and almost impossible volume broke free and thundered down the slope into the deep ocean basin. The displaced water had to go somewhere. It went everywhere. The tsunami radiated outward from the collapse zone, racing across the North Sea at speeds approaching 500 meters per hour. When it reached the shallow waters around Doggerland, the waves slowed but grew. 20 meters high in some places, perhaps higher in others. There would have been no warning, no time to gather belongings, no time to reach high ground. The wave came, and it came fast. Entire valleys flooded in minutes. Coastal plains vanished beneath churning water. Rivers reversed course, surging backward inland with devastating force. The psychological horror of that moment is almost impossible to grasp. The world that had stood for 10,000 years erased in a single day under a wall of water that gave no mercy and left no escape. But here is the critical detail that archaeology reveals. The people did not vanish. Doggerland's material culture does not simply stop appearing in the record, as if the entire population was wiped out. Instead, what we see is displacement. The same tool types, the same technological traditions, begin appearing elsewhere in Denmark, along the Baltic coast, and in regions further south and east. The genetic signature of Doggerland's people does not disappear from history. It disperses. Survivors fled. They had to. Some went north to higher ground in what is now Norway. Some went east into Denmark and beyond. And some, perhaps driven by desperation, perhaps following ancient roots, perhaps simply walking away from the sea that had betrayed them, went south, far south. Tens of thousands escaping a drowned homeland raises a deeper mystery. Where did they migrate to, and how far could they have traveled? Migration is rarely a straight line. When populations flee catastrophe, they do not march in organized columns toward predetermined destinations. They scatter. They follow terrain that allows passage. They move toward resources. They recognize rivers for fishing, forests for hunting, and coastlines for gathering. And they carry with them the skills that kept them alive in the world they lost. For the survivors of Doggerland, the geography of escape was limited by what remained accessible after the tsunami. The North Sea had become impossible. The Atlantic coast offered no refuge. The only viable route led east and south across what is now Denmark, through the Baltic corridor, and eventually toward the great river systems that connected northern Europe to the Near East. This was not a single exodus. It could not have been. Displaced populations would have moved in waves over generations, some settling temporarily in regions that resembled their lost homeland, others continuing the journey when resources grew scarce or when the trauma of living near the sea became unbearable. Archaeological evidence suggests the migration followed a predictable pattern. The same technological signatures that defined Doggerland's Mesolithic culture begin appearing along the Baltic coast shortly after 6200 BC. Then they show up further south in regions bordering the Black Sea. And then, faintly but unmistakably, traces appear in the Levant in northern Mesopotamia. The clearest markers are the tools themselves. Doggerland's people were masters of microlith technology, small, precisely shaped stone blades that could be fitted into composite tools. These were not crude implements. They acquired sophisticated knapping techniques, an understanding of stone fracture mechanics, and the ability to produce standardized forms that could be replicated across generations. Microliths were the hallmark of northern European hunter-gatherers, refined over thousands of years into one of the most efficient tool systems in the Mesolithic world. After the Storega slide, these distinctive blade industries appear in places they had never been before. In Denmark, archaeologists find campsites dating to the centuries immediately following the tsunami, showing tool assemblages nearly identical to those from submerged Doggerland sites, the same narrow blade cores, the same geometric microliths. Further south along the northern Mediterranean, researchers have documented intrusive technologies toolkits that appear suddenly without local developmental sequences. Harpoon points designed for deepwater fishing show up in Adriatic coastal sites. Specialized scrapers used for processing marine resources appear in the Balkans, far from any ocean. The pattern continues into the Near East. At sites in the Levant dating to the 7th and 6th millennium BC, excavators have uncovered blade types that do not match local traditions. They are thinner, more finely worked, and show flaking patterns characteristic of northern European techniques. Some show evidence of composite hafting, multiple blades set into wood inner bone handles, a distinctly Doggerland innovation. These are not simple coincidences or cases of independent invention. The techniques are too specific, the timing too precise, and the geographic distribution too linear. Someone carried this knowledge southwards, someone who had learned these methods in the forests and wetlands of a world that no longer existed. But tools are only part of the story. When catastrophe displaces a population, it does more than scatter people across geography. It speeds up cultural transmission in ways stable societies never experience. Anthropologists call this the refugee bottleneck effect, the phenomenon where survival pressures force rapid innovation and concentrate knowledge among those who remain. In stable times, cultures change slowly. Traditions are preserved because they work. Innovation happens at the margins. But when a population is traumatized, when the old ways no longer work because the landscape itself has changed, adaptation becomes survival. Doggerland's refugees would have faced exactly this pressure. Their traditional fishing grounds were gone. Their seasonal hunting routes were underwater. The communal gathering sites where generations had met were erased. Everything that defined their relationship to the land had been destroyed. Yet they carried something irreplaceable: memory. They remembered how to organize labor for larger-scale projects. They remembered seasonal coordination, the timing of migrations, and the management of resources across communities. They remembered how to read landscapes, how to find water, how to identify productive soils. And they remembered that the sea could not be trusted. This last point may be the most important. The population that has watched the ocean destroy everything they knew does not settle peacefully on vulnerable coastlines. They move inland. They seek high ground. They build away from water. But they develop technologies to control it. The psychological imprint of catastrophe shapes behavior for generations. When we look at where displaced Doggerland populations seem to have settled, the Baltic interior, the Balkan highlands, and eventually the river valleys of the Near East, we see a pattern. These are not coastal sites. These are inland refuges, places where rivers could be managed rather than feared, where elevation provided safety from floods that might come again. And in those river valleys, something else becomes visible in the archaeological record. The slow emergence of techniques that would later define civilization. Water management appears earlier than expected in regions along the refugee route. Small-scale irrigation channels show up in Balkan sites. Seasonal flood prediction becomes embedded in agricultural planning throughout the Near East. Stoneline wells are dug deeper and more systematically than previous generations had attempted. These are not random developments. They are the innovations of people who understand water as both resource and threat, people who learned at catastrophic cost that survival depends on controlling what once controlled them. The migration from Doggerland to Mesopotamia would have taken centuries, perhaps a full millennium, but each generation carried forward the knowledge of the last, refining it, adapting it, passing it down. By the time descendants of Doggerland refugees reached the marshlands of southern Iraq, they were no longer simply hunter-gatherers fleeing a drowned coast. They were survivors who had spent 1,000 years learning how to rebuild. But how do we trace the footsteps of people who left almost nothing behind? The trail left by tools can be erased. Settlements can be buried. Pottery can shatter. But genes are different. Genes persist. Every human carries within their DNA a record of ancient journeys, migrations, encounters, survival bottlenecks, and moments when populations mixed in ways that left permanent traces. For decades, archaeologists relied on artifacts alone to reconstruct the past. But in the last 20 years, ancient DNA analysis has opened a window into history that no amount of pottery shards could provide. And what that window reveals about the connection between Europe and the Near East is deeply unexpected. The technique is straightforward in concept, revolutionary in practice. Researchers extract DNA from skeletal remains and sequence the genome, then compare it to other ancient genomes, building a map of genetic relationships across time and space. When populations share specific genetic markers, it means they share ancestry. When those markers appear in places they should not, someone traveled. In 2015, a team of geneticists published a comprehensive study of ancient Near Eastern DNA, tracing the origins of early farmers who first cultivated wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent. The expectation was straightforward. These farmers would show genetic continuity with earlier Near Eastern hunter-gatherers. What they found instead was a puzzle. Embedded within the genomes of early Mesopotamian populations were traces of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, genetic signatures characteristic of Mesolithic Europeans. These were not minor traces. In some individuals from the Ubaid period, the culture that immediately preceded Sumer, the WHG component reached levels that could not be explained by random gene flow or ancient shared ancestry from tens of thousands of years prior. Someone from Europe had reached Mesopotamia, and they had done so during the exact window when Doggerland was collapsing. The WHG signature is distinctive. It represents populations who lived in Europe during the Mesolithic between roughly 12,000 and 6,000 BC. These were the people of the forests, rivers, and coastlines, the hunters and fishers who lived in landscapes from Spain to Scandinavia, including Doggerland. Their genetic profile differs markedly from both earlier Paleolithic Europeans and the later Neolithic farmers who arrived from Anatolia. When that signature appears in the Near East, it tells a story of movement. But the puzzle deepens when researchers look more closely at the timing. The WHG admixture in Near Eastern populations does not appear gradually, as if from slow, steady contact over millennia. It appears suddenly, concentrated in individuals dating to the 7th and 6th millennia BC, precisely the centuries following the Stregus slide. Population geneticists have a term for this kind of pattern of founder effect. It occurs when a small group from one population migrates into another region and contributes disproportionately to the local gene pool. If that founding group arrives during a period of population instability, say, after a major climate disruption, their genetic signature can spread quickly through the receiving population. The 6200 BC event was not limited to Doggerland. Paleoclimatologists have documented a global cooling episode at exactly that moment. Freshwater from melting ice poured into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and plunging the northern hemisphere into a cold snap that lasted more than a century. Crops failed. Drought struck the Near East. Populations contracted. And into that unstable world came refugees carrying European genetics, people fleeing their own catastrophe, arriving just as the Near East was reeling from climatic chaos. Under those conditions, survival favored flexibility. Communities that could integrate new knowledge, new technologies, and new people had an advantage over those that remained isolated. The genetic evidence suggests that integration happened, and it happened rapidly. But there is another layer to the puzzle. Those populations. When geneticists model ancient DNA, they sometimes find signals that do not match any known population. These are ancestry components that appear in the genetic data, but have no corresponding skeletal remains, no archaeological culture to claim them. They are ghost populations that contributed to later groups, but left no direct descendants or clearly identifiable material culture. In studies of early Sumer-adjacent populations, multiple ghost signals appear. One shows clear affinities with European hunter-gatherers. Another suggests a mixture from a population that no longer exists in any form, but whose genetic contribution was large enough to shape the metabolic and immune profiles of early Mesopotamians. Why would those profiles matter? Because genes are not just markers of ancestry. They are tools for survival. Certain genetic adaptations help populations thrive in specific environments. Mesolithic Europeans living in cold, variable climates with seasonal resource scarcity developed metabolic efficiencies that Near Eastern populations lacked. They process fats differently. They tolerated longer periods without food. They adapted to the boom and bust cycles of northern ecosystems. When those populations moved south and mixed with Near Eastern groups, their genetic adaptations moved with them. Some of those adaptations would have been helpful in the unpredictable climate of the 7th millennium BC. When droughts and cold snaps made resource management critical, natural selection does not care about borders. It favors what works. In a world recovering from simultaneous catastrophes, the genetic toolkit of Doggerland's refugees may have offered exactly what the Near East needed. The genetic evidence also reveals something about the journey itself. Founder effects and genetic drift. The random changes that build up when populations are small create distinctive patterns. When researchers trace the WHG signal through intermediate populations along the Baltic corridor and into the Black Sea region, they see exactly those patterns. Small groups moving, settling briefly, mixing with local populations, then moving again. This was not a mass migration in the way we imagine armies or colonizations. It was a slow diffusion, generation by generation, carried by people who had no maps and no grand plan, only the instinct to move away from the sea and toward landscapes that might sustain them. By the time their descendants reached Mesopotamia, the genetic connection to Doggerland would have been diluted but still detectable. And that connection carried something beyond mere biology. Genetic movement across continents raises a deeper question. Did their knowledge, technologies, symbols, and memories make the journey as well? Genes tell us that people moved, but genes alone cannot tell us what they brought with them. For that, we turn back to the ground, to the fragments of stone, bone, and clay that survive when everything else decays. These are the fingerprints of culture, the physical traces of how people thought, worked, and solved the problems of survival. And when those fingerprints appear in places they do not belong, they tell us something archaeology has long struggled to explain. Technology does not usually leap across continents. It develops locally, shaped by available materials, environmental pressures, and generations of accumulated knowledge. A tool tradition refined in the forests of Northern Europe should stay in Northern Europe. It should evolve there, diversify there, and eventually be replaced there by newer methods. It should not appear suddenly and fully formed 3,000 meters away in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. Yet that is exactly what happens after 6,200 BC. Begin with the microliths. In Chapter 2, we noted their appearance along the migration route, but the pattern goes far beyond the Baltic corridor. At sites in the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coast that forms the western edge of the Fertile Crescent, excavators, working in layers dated to the 7th millennium BC, have found something puzzling. Mixed in with local tool assemblages are blades that do not fit. They are narrower than regional traditions, more geometric in form, and produced using a distinctive core preparation technique. The bases show evidence of hafting, tiny notches and wear patterns, indicating they were set into composite tools with multiple blades working in parallel. This is not a Levantine innovation. This is Northern European microlith technology transported intact. The same pattern appears further east at early Mesopotamian sites that predate the rise of Sumer. Archaeologists have documented toolkits that mix local flintworking traditions with intrusive elements. Scrapers designed for processing hides using methods perfected in cold climates. Urns engraving tools shaped in ways characteristic of Baltic workshops. Projectile points with basal thinning techniques unknown in the Near East, but common in Mesolithic Scandinavia. Typological analysis, the systematic comparison of tool forms across regions, reveals the connections. When researchers compare the dimensions, flaking angles, and use wear patterns of these Near Eastern anomalies with known European types, the matches are precise. These are not convergent designs arrived at independently. These are transplanted technologies. But stone tools are only the beginning. Pottery offers an even stranger puzzle. Ceramic traditions are highly conservative, passed down within communities with remarkable continuity. Potters' techniques become cultural signatures as distinctive as language. Yet in the 7th millennium BC, pottery appears in the Near East, showing decorative motifs with no local precedent. Wave patterns incised into jar rims. Geometric impressions made with shell edges. Linear designs applied with comb-like tools. These motifs are characteristic of Atlantic European pottery traditions, coastal cultures stretching from Iberia to the North Sea, including Doggerland. At sites in Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, sherds with these exact patterns turn up in layers dating to the centuries following the Stregus slide. Some show hybrid designs, bases shaped in local styles, but decorated with northern European motifs as if made by potters trained in two traditions at the same time. This is what happens when displaced populations integrate with local communities. They adapt their techniques to new materials and contexts, but they keep parts of their original cultural vocabulary, the symbols and patterns that carry meaning beyond function. The evidence extends to bone and antler work. In Northern Europe, Mesolithic peoples carved symbolic marks into tools and ornaments, parallel lines, cross-hatching, chevron patterns, and abstract geometric forms. These were not random decorations. They appear repeatedly across time and space, suggesting a shared symbolic language. After 6,200 BC, these same motifs begin appearing on bone artifacts in the Near East. harpoon points etched with parallel grooves, balls marked with cross-etched patterns, perforated shells strung in arrangements identical to those found in submerged Doggerland sites. Symbolic systems are not easily transmitted. They carry cultural meaning that outsiders rarely adopt whole. When the same symbols appear across vast distances during narrow time windows, it suggests not trade or casual contact, but the physical presence of people who carried those symbols as part of their identity. Comparative archaeology has documented this pattern repeatedly, but institutional archaeology has struggled to explain it. The traditional model assumes Near Eastern civilization developed in isolation, emerging naturally from local populations. That model cannot account for the sudden appearance of fully developed foreign technologies. So the anomalies are noted, catalogued, and filed away as curiosities misstated perhaps, or the result of poorly understood trade networks. But the clustering tells a different story. These intrusive technologies do not appear randomly scattered across millennia. They cluster in a specific period, the 7th and 6th millennia BC, immediately following the destruction of Doggerland and the 6200 BC climate disruption. They appear along a geographic corridor stretching from the Baltic through the Black Sea region into the Fertile Crescent. And they appear in contexts suggesting not trade goods, but resident populations. Tools worn from daily use. Pottery produced locally with foreign techniques. Symbolic systems woven into community practice. This is the signature of migration, not commerce. When archaeologists excavate early farming villages in the Near East from this period, they find mixed assemblages that do not make sense under isolated development models. Local grinding stones sit alongside scrapers designed for cold climates. Storage pits show organizational patterns similar to Baltic seasonal camps. Someone brought these practices together. And the only historical event large enough to trigger that kind of cultural mixing was the displacement of tens of thousands of people from a drowning world. The tools that should not be there are there. The pottery that should not exist does exist. The symbolic systems that should have stayed in Europe traveled to Mesopotamia. But if the refugees carried tools and memory, could they also have carried ideas powerful enough to reshape the future? For nearly 2,000 years, the descendants of Doggerland's refugees moved through landscapes that no longer exist, carrying knowledge that would eventually reshape human history. But between the drowning of their homeland and the rise of the world's first cities, there is a gap, centuries of adaptation, integration, and transmission that left few clear traces. And then, suddenly, Sumer appears. Not gradually, not experimentally, but as if someone had drawn up plans for civilization itself and carried them out with startling precision. The conventional story teaches that civilization emerged slowly from agricultural villages. Early farmers, through trial and error over many generations, learned to cooperate, to organize, to build larger settlements, and eventually to create cities. This process, we are told, took thousands of years of gradual growth of social complexity, building from simple to sophisticated. Sumer does not fit that story. Around 4300 BC, in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, urban centers begin to appear. By 3500 BC, less than a millennium later, Uruk has grown into a city of perhaps 40,000 people, surrounded by smaller settlements connected through irrigation networks, managed by complex bureaucracies, and recorded in written language. Archaeologists call this the Uruk expansion, the period when Sumerian culture spread across the region with a speed that challenges standard models of cultural development. But the mystery is not just the speed. It is what appears fully formed from the very beginning. Start with the cities themselves. When excavators first uncovered the lowest levels of Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be their oldest city, they expected to find simple beginnings, modest structures, experimental layouts, the awkward first attempts of people learning to live together in large numbers. What they found instead was sophistication. Even in its earliest phases, Eridu shows urban planning. Buildings are lined along deliberate axes. Public spaces are separated from residential zones. The temple platform, the architectural form that would later evolve into massive ziggurats, appears not as a late invention, but as a founding element, suggesting that religious and civic organization were inseparable from the city's very design. At Uruk, the pattern is even more striking. The city emerges with monumental architecture already in place. The White Temple, built around 3200 BC, sits atop a platform 40 feet high. The Ina district shows large-scale craft production, centralized storage, and administrative buildings, all pointing to bureaucratic systems capable of managing resources across an entire urban economy. This is not what early experimentation looks like. This is what implementation looks like. Then there is the water. Southern Mesopotamia is not naturally easy for agriculture. Rainfall is sparse and unreliable. The Tigris and Euphrates flood unpredictably, often at the wrong times for planting. Summer heat is extreme. Without irrigation, larger-scale farming is impossible. Without larger-scale farming, cities cannot survive. The Sumerians understood this from the start, and they solved it with irrigation systems that appear without clear antecedents. These were not simple ditches. Sumerian irrigation was hydraulic engineering. Canals ran for miles, feeding multiple settlements. Levees controlled seasonal flooding. Drainage systems prevented salt buildup. Basin irrigation requires a precise understanding of water flow, soil absorption, and seasonal timing. It also requires coordinated labor, workers digging and maintaining channels, administrators tracking distribution, and systems managing conflicts between settlements competing for resources. All of this appears to be working in early Sumer, with no visible developmental arc. Archaeologists have searched for simpler prototypes. Small experimental canals in pre-Sumerian villages. Trial and error irrigation in the Ubaid period. But the evidence is sparse. What exists suggests that when larger-scale irrigation appears, it appears already organized into a system. How does a population learn to manage water on that scale without centuries of failure and refinement? One answer they already knew. The same question arises with Sumerian administration. Complex societies require record-keeping, tracking goods, labor, debts, and obligations. The Sumerians developed writing to meet that need. And the earliest examples of cuneiform script appear around 3200 BC. But here is the puzzle. Writing does not emerge as crude symbols slowly refined over generations. It appears in a mature form, able from the beginning to record complex economic transactions. The earliest tablets from Uruk record grain stores, livestock inventories, and labor assignments using a sophisticated system of numerical notation and pictographic signs. Proto-cuneiform shows evidence of systematic organization. Signs are standardized. Grammatical conventions exist. Scribes follow consistent formatting rules. This is not people inventing writing. This is people using a recording system that has already been worked out. Archaeologists have suggested that simpler precursors existed, perhaps clay tokens used for counting, or perishable materials that left no trace. And tokens did exist in earlier periods. But the gap between token-based counting and full written language is huge. It is the difference between counting sheep and writing administrative contracts. Sumer makes that leap in what appears archaeologically to be a single bound. The same pattern appears in Sumerian astronomy. The earliest texts show sophisticated mathematical systems for tracking celestial cycles. The Sumerians calculated lunar months with precision, predicted planetary movements, and developed a BASC 60 number system still used today for measuring time and angles. This level of astronomical knowledge takes generations of careful observation. You cannot predict celestial cycles without watching the sky systematically over long periods, recording patterns, and building mathematical models to explain irregularities. Cultures develop astronomical skills slowly, as specialists build up data across lifetimes. Yet Sumerian astronomy appears to begin at an advanced level. The mathematical frameworks are already in place. The observational methods are standardized. The predictive models work. Where did they learn to watch the sky like that? Urban archaeology has faced these questions again and again, and struggles to answer them. The standard response assumes that earlier developmental stages existed, but have not yet been found, that the archaeological record is incomplete, that sites remain unexcavated, that evidence lies buried beneath later construction. This is possible. The lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. But the clustering of empty foundations, irrigation without prototypes, writing without precursors, urban planning without experimentation, astronomy without developmental stages suggests something more than simple gaps in the record. It suggests that the knowledge base supporting Sumerian civilization came from outside the immediate region. Consider what would be required to build Sumer as it appears. You would need populations experienced in larger-scale coordination. You would need engineers skilled in water management. You would need administrative systems capable of organizing labor. You would need astronomers trained in sky observation. And you would need all of this woven into a single cultural framework. Where does that framework come from? The Sumer's founders were refugees descended from populations traumatized by water populations who had spent 2,000 years adapting across shifting landscapes. Then, the sudden appearance of sophisticated systems makes more sense. These would not be people learning from scratch. These would be people rebuilding with inherited knowledge, refined by necessity and adapted to new environments. The irrigation systems begin to look like the work of people who remembered what uncontrolled water could do, and were determined never to be helpless before it again. The urban planning looks like the work of people who understood communal organization from generations of seasonal gatherings. The astronomical observations look like the work of people who had watched the sky for centuries, tracking seasonal change as they moved across continents. And the writing looks like the work of people who needed to preserve knowledge in a world where oral tradition alone could no longer be trusted, not when memory itself had been drowned. Sumer does not feel like a beginning. It feels like a culmination, a gathering point where displaced populations carrying fragments of older worlds came together in a landscape that offered one last chance to build something permanent. And this time they built with the certainty of people who knew exactly what was needed, because they had already lost everything once before. Seeing Sumer as a continuation raises a deeper question. Which earlier world set the stage for its rise? Every culture tells stories about the past. Most are understood as allegory, more lessons wrapped in narrative form. But sometimes, buried inside myth, there are details too specific to be pure invention. Geographical precision. Environmental description. Technological knowledge that hints the story preserves something real. The Sumerians had such a story, and it was about water. The earliest written version appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, though fragments of the tale exist in texts that predate even that ancient work. The story tells of Utnapishtim called Sisutra, and older Sumerian versions a man warned by the gods that a catastrophic flood would destroy the world. He builds a great boat, seals it with pitch, and loads it with his family, craftsmen, and animals. The flood comes. Waters rise until they cover the mountains. Everything that exists is destroyed. Only those in the boat survive. When the waters recede, Utnapishtim sends out birds to search for dry land. First, a dove, which returns. Then a swallow, which also returns. Finally, a raven, which does not come back, proof that somewhere land has emerged from the chaos. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. The survivors step off. They make offerings to the gods. And from that remnant, the world begins again. This is usually read as cosmic mythology, a story about divine judgment and rebirth. But read it again with Doggerland in mind, and different details emerge. The flood is not gradual. It is catastrophic, overwhelming, unstoppable. It comes suddenly like a war. The text says this is not the slow rise of the seas. This is a tsunami. The survivors escape by boat, not by running to the land, not by climbing to high places, but by going onto the water. This is exactly what people along Doggerland's coast would have done when the Steregos slide hit. Boats were their technology, their advantage, the tool that let fishing communities survive what people on land could not. And very importantly, the story shows that knowledge was saved. Utnapishtim brings craftsmen aboard, people who carry skills, not just bodies. The meaning is clear. Survival is not just about bodies, but also about culture. What matters is that the old world's wisdom lives on into the new world. This patterned sudden flood, boat escape, saving knowledge appears over and over in ancient Near Eastern traditions. The Babylonian Atarhasis story, the biblical Noah, the Greek Deucalion each tells basically the same story with small differences in details but the same main structure. Mythology experts have noticed these similarities for a long time, and usually say they happened because cultures in the Near East shared stories. The story spread through trade and conquest, getting changed and retold by different civilizations. But that explanation assumes the story started in Mesopotamia. What if it didn't? What if the story traveled with the refugees themselves? Northern European traditions have their own flood myths, though they are less welcoming than their Near Eastern versions. Celtic mythology talks about drowned lands off the western coasts, sunken kingdoms beneath the waves where cities once stood. Welsh tradition remembers Cantor Gwalad, a land swallowed by the sea after a terrible break. Breton legends tell of this, a wealthy city lost to flooding when the ocean broke through its walls. These are often dismissed as purely Madoop stories, coastal people's common fear of a sea-given story form. But the geography is exact. The Welsh legends place their drowned lands exactly where Doggerland's southern parts would have been. The depths match. The descriptions of fertile plains and lots of resources match. Even the timeline, when traced back through family trees and king lists, points toward the early Holocene, the exact time when Doggerland existed. The Orkney Islands off Scotland's northern coast keep stories of a great wave that came from the east and destroyed the old world. The Norse remember from Bullwinter, a terrible climate event followed by floods that changed the landscape. Danish tradition talks about lands lost to the sea, about ancestors who fled inland when the waters rose. These are not Near Eastern stories moved northward. These are native Northern European memories, and they describe the same events, sudden terrible flooding that destroyed a living world. Anthropologists studying oral tradition have recorded a process they call mythic encoding, the way traumatic historical events become saved in story form. Disasters that threaten a population's survival get remembered not as dry factual reports, but as emotionally powerful stories, often including supernatural elements that make them easier to remember and pass on. The key is being specific. General flood myths appear worldwide because flooding is a common human experience. But when myths from different areas share specific details, boat building techniques, the order of bird releases, the focus on saving craftsmen, and knowledge, it suggests not separate invention, but shared beginning. The Sumerian flood myth has elements that make no sense in a Mesopotamian setting. Mesopotamia does have floods, but they are seasonal and predictable, caused by snow melting in the northern mountains. They do not cover mountains. They do not come suddenly like wars. They do not need boat evacuation. You simply move to higher ground and wait for the water to go down. But for a coastal population hit by a mega tsunami, every detail fits. The boat is not just transportation. It is survival technology already perfected by sea-adapted peoples. The suddenness matches the Steregos slide's impact. The focus on the water covering everything makes sense for people whose entire visible world was at sea level and could be completely flooded. Even the bird releases using ravens and doves to find land reflects the practice of coastal sailors who use birds to find distant shores. And saving the craftsman is not a mythological decoration. It is a survival strategy. When a population is forced to move suddenly, cultural knowledge becomes the most valuable thing. Skills cannot be quickly relearned. They need years of training. A refugee community that saves its specialists saves its ability to rebuild. The 6200 BC climate event gives another layer of explanation. This was not a local disaster. The cooling episode caused by the Laurentide ice sheet collapse affected the entire northern half of Earth. Drought hit the Near East. Floods destroyed parts of Europe. Storms got stronger. Growing seasons got shorter. Populations across huge areas would have experienced disaster at the same time, each in their local way. But for displaced Doggerland refugees arriving in the Near East during this same time, their story would have connected powerfully with local populations who were also struggling from environmental crisis. Shared trauma creates cultural bonding. When newcomers arrive carrying stories of worlds destroyed by water and climate chaos, and when the receiving population has just experienced similar disasters, those stories get mixed in quickly. They become founding stories, origin myths that explain not just where the newcomers came from, but why the gods seem angry, why the world is unstable, why survival needs constant watching. Over generations, the difference between their story and our story fades. The myths blend, and what comes out is a story that belongs to everyone, a shared memory of disaster that shapes cultural identity for thousands of years. This is why mythological alignment matters. Myths are conservative. They resist change. Main story elements stay stable across huge spans of time because communities give them meaning. When myths from distant areas share not just general themes but specific story structures and technological details, it suggests real historical connection. The Sumerian flood myth is not a metaphor. It is memory distant, changed by countless retellings, placed in religious frameworks that came later, but memory nonetheless. Memory of a world that drowned. Memory of boats that saved those who knew how to build them. Memory of knowledge carried through disaster by people who understood that survival meant saving not just lives, but the skills to rebuild. And if that memory traveled from Dogland to Sumer across 2,000 years and 3,000 miles, then it did not travel alone. Story surviving across distance raises another question. What physical evidence could have traveled with them? The absence of overwhelming evidence is not proof of absence. It is sometimes simply the nature of what we are trying to find. Archaeology is a science built on pieces. We rebuild entire civilizations from broken pottery, analyze social structures. From burial patterns, trace trade networks from scattered beads. The field has always worked with incomplete data, filling gaps through guessing, comparison, and probability reasoning. But some kinds of evidence are harder to find than others. And some historical events, especially those involving migration, displacement, and cultural transmission, leave traces so faint that only careful combining reveals them at all. The connection between Dogland and Sumer is one of those patterns. The evidence exists, but it is scattered across 8,000 years, multiple continents, and several academic fields that rarely talk to one another. To understand why the connection is not more obvious, we need to understand the specific ways the evidence can disappear. Start with Doggerland itself. The landscape that once supported tens of thousands of people now lies beneath 50 feet of seawater, covered by additional meters of sediment deposited over 8,000 years. The North Sea is not a gentle preserving environment. Currents scrub the seafloor. Trolling nets drag across ancient sites. Sediment shifts with storms. And unlike land archaeology where sites can be carefully dug up, underwater investigation is expensive, technologically challenging, and limited in reach. What has been recovered from Dogland comes mostly from accidental discoveries, artifacts pulled up in fishing nets, bone pieces exposed by coastal erosion, occasional targeted surveys using sonar, and core sampling. These glimpses reveal exciting evidence of advanced settlement, but they cannot provide the complete archaeological context that would allow detailed cultural reconstruction. We know Dogland was inhabited. We know it was culturally complex, but we cannot dig up its villages, study its house patterns, or trace its internal trade networks. The most direct evidence of what Dogland's culture actually was remains impossible to reach, buried beneath an ocean. This creates a basic problem. We are trying to trace the influence of a culture whose physical record is mostly unavailable for study. Then there is the nature of migration itself. When populations move, they rarely leave clear archaeological signs. Permanent settlements produce lots of material pottery, buildings, trash pits that build up over generations. But people traveling light carry portable tools, essential supplies, and knowledge. They leave behind items that break. They make temporary camps that leave tiny traces. And when they do settle, they adopt local materials and methods, blending their traditions with those of the populations they join. The migration route from Doggerland to Mesopotamia would have crossed landscapes that are themselves archaeologically challenging. The Baltic corridor has been heavily disturbed by later settlement. The Black Sea region was partially flooded when sea levels rose. The Near East has been continuously lived in for 10,000 years, with later buildings destroying earlier layers. Even when migrant populations do leave traces, those traces are often wrongly identified. An unusual tool type gets catalogued as trade goods. A technological innovation gets credited to local experimentation. Unless researchers are specifically looking for evidence of long-distance migration and have a thinking framework to interpret it, the signs go unrecognized. Early Mesopotamian archaeology has its own complications. The Great Sumerian cities were lived in continuously for thousands of years. Each generation built on top of the ruins of the last, creating artificial hills called tells, made of compressed building layers. Digging these requires removing later material to reach earlier deposits, and much of the earliest material is buried dozens of feet down under thousands of years of built-up debris. This means that the Ubaid period, the culture right before Sumer when displaced populations would have been arriving, and mixing in is among the least accessible archaeologically. Many sites have been only partially dug up. Early excavations done before modern layering methods mix materials from different periods. And ongoing site destruction from looting, construction, and conflict means that evidence is being lost faster than it can be studied. Yet, even within these limits, oddities exist. Archaeologists working in Ubaid layers have recorded tool types that do not fit local development sequences. Pottery showing unexpected style elements, building features with no clear earlier version, storage systems suggesting organizational practices foreign to the region. These are catalogued, published in specialist journals, and filed away as curiosities. The problem is not that the evidence does not exist. The problem is that it exists alone, disconnected data points that only form a pattern when viewed together across multiple sites, time periods, and artifact categories. This brings us to institutional archaeology itself, and the ways that field boundaries shape what questions get asked. Near Eastern archaeology developed as a separate field from European prehistory. They have different research traditions, different time frameworks, different theoretical approaches. A specialist in Sumerian city life rarely reads literature on Mesolithic Scandinavia. A scholar of Doggerland has little reason to study Mesopotamian irrigation systems. This creates mental walls where connections across regions go unexplored, not because the evidence contradicts them, but because the field structure makes them difficult to see. There is also a cautious bias in archaeology about migration theories. For much of the 20th century, migration was used too easily to explain cultural change, often in ways that supported nationalist or colonialist stories. In response, the field shifted toward models emphasizing local development and native innovation. This correction was necessary, but it created a new bias reluctance to propose long-distance population movements, even when evidence supports them. Suggesting that European populations contributed to Sumerian civilization challenges established stories about the independent development of Near Eastern city life. It risks appearing to reduce Mesopotamian achievements or to bring back outdated spreading theories. As a result, researchers who notice odd evidence often frame it carefully, if they frame it at all, avoiding interpretations that might be controversial. The pattern that comes out then is one of breaking apart by design. Evidence exists in Doggerland, but it is underwater. Evidence exists along the migration route, but it is spread out and disturbed. Evidence exists in Sumer, but it is buried under later cities and catalogued without connecting analysis. And the academic structures that might connect these pieces are divided by field boundaries and theoretical caution. Yet when the pieces are put together, genetic data showing European ancestry in Mesopotamia, tool types appearing suddenly in the Near East, methodological parallels between regions, irrigation systems with no local prototypes, and the exact time alignment of Doggerland's destruction with Near Eastern population changes, a pattern becomes visible. It is faint. It is incomplete, but it is there. The archaeology of disappearance is always challenging. Populations that leave their homelands under terrible circumstances rarely leave convenient markers announcing their journey. Cultures that blend with existing communities mix in rather than stand apart. And time, weather, and human activity erase more than they save. What remains is what always remains in archaeology: fragments that must be interpreted, patterns that come out only through patient combining, and conclusions that rest on built-up probability rather than single proof. The question is not whether perfect evidence exists in some perfect undisturbed site waiting to be discovered. The question is whether the pattern of fragmentary evidence drawn from geology, genetics, material culture, mythology, and urban development points steadily in the same direction. And it does. With the physical record incomplete, where else can we search for the pieces that are still missing? There are moments in investigation when separate lines of evidence followed independently suddenly come together. When geological data match genetic findings. When material culture confirms what mythology suggested. When the pattern that seemed too broken to trust reveals itself as complete. This is one of those moments, because when you place the evidence side by side, not cherry-picking convenient facts, but examining the full archaeological, genetic, mythological, and environmental record, the timelines cross with accuracy that is hard to dismiss as chance. Begin with the date 6200 BC. This is not a random marker. It is a geological event line recorded across multiple independent data sources. Ice core samples from Greenland show a sudden climate shift. Sediment cores from the North Sea reveal the Storego slide tsunami deposits. Climate reconstructions confirm a global cooling episode. Tree ring. Data from Europe shows disrupted growth patterns. Pollen records show vegetation changes across the northern half of Earth. At this exact moment, Doggerland experiences terrible destruction, not gradual sinking, but violent sudden destruction. The tsunami hits. The remaining landmass floods. Tens of thousands of people are displaced. And at this exact moment, something changes in the Near East. Population genetics shows it first. Ancient DNA studies reveal that the 7th millennium BC, the centuries right after 6200 BC, marks a period of unusual genetic mixing in Mesopotamia. Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, which is typical of European populations, appears in Near Eastern genomes where it should not be. The signal is not evenly spread across time. It groups in this specific period. Ghost population signatures show up in the data ancestry pieces from groups that left no direct descendants, but contributed a lot to early Mesopotamian farmers. These ghosts show connections with Northern European Mesolithic peoples. Their genetic contribution arrives suddenly, concentrated in a narrow time window. The timing is not by chance. It maps exactly onto the displacement window created by Doggerland's destruction and the 6200 BC climate event. Population modeling strengthens this. Population studies of the Near East show expansion during the 7th millennium BC. Population surges that exceed what local birth rates would produce. New settlements appear. Existing villages grow. The archaeological signature matches incoming populations mixing with established communities. Where do these new people come from? The standard model assumes internal migration within the Near East populations, shifting from edge zones into more productive regions. But genetic data contradicts this. The incoming ancestry is not local. It comes from outside the region, from populations with European genetic profiles. The migration route is traceable, not through a continuous archaeological trail. As Chapter 7 explained, migration rarely leaves such clear marks but through stepping stones of evidence. Western hunter-gatherer genetic signatures appear first in Denmark after 6200 BC, then along the Baltic corridor, then in the Black Sea region, and finally in the Levant and northern Mesopotamia. Each step shows the same pattern: sudden appearance, mixing with local populations, then thinning as descendants move onward. This is exactly what long-distance migration looks like in the genetic record: small founding groups moving step by step over generations, mixing with local populations at each stage, gradually carrying genetic and cultural material across huge distances. The material culture confirms it. The tool industries we look at in Chapter 4, microliths, blade technologies, harpoon designs, form a bridge connecting Northern Europe to the Near East. They appear suddenly in regions along the migration path during the centuries after 6200 BC. These are not trade items moving through exchange networks. They are technologies carried by mobile populations, adapted to new materials and settings, but keeping their basic forms. Pottery traditions show the same pattern. Atlantic European decorative designs appear on Near Eastern ceramics. Symbol systems from Northern Europe show up on bone artifacts in Mesopotamia. These are cultural markers carried by people who learned them in one place and continued practicing them in another. The mythology we explored in Chapter 6 takes on new meaning in this light. The Sumerian flood myth is not just a story. It is a memory written in story form, describing events that actually happened. The Northern European flood legends are not just similar myths. They are accounts of the same disaster saved by different branches of the same displaced population. When myths from distant regions share not just general themes but specific details: boat construction, bird releases, knowledge saving, sudden terrible flooding, it shows shared beginning. And when those myths line up in time with recorded geological events, they change from folklore to historical evidence. The 6200 BC climate event works as a matching mechanism, creating shared trauma across populations that would otherwise have no reason to tell the same stories. But for Doggerland refugees arriving in the Near East during this period, their flood story would have connected powerfully with local communities also. Suffering from climate instability. Shared disaster creates cultural bonding. The myths blend, and what comes out is a founding story that belongs to both groups. Now return to Sumer. The technological skill we recorded in Chapter 5, irrigation appearing without earlier versions, urban planning put in place rather than developed, writing coming out in mature form, astronomical knowledge working at advanced levels no longer seems unexplainable. The Sumer's founders included descendants of Doggerland refugees who had spent 2,000 years adapting, innovating, and saving knowledge across huge migrations. Then these systems begin to make sense not as inventions created from nothing, but as solutions put in place by people who already understood the rules. The irrigation systems look like the work of populations hurt by uncontrolled water, determined to master it rather than be hurt by it again. The urban planning looks like communities experienced in large-scale seasonal coordination, applying that knowledge to permanent settlement. The astronomical observations look like the built-up wisdom of people who had watched the sky for generations while moving across continents, using sky markers to navigate and track seasons. And the writing, the sudden appearance of mature recording system looks like the response of populations who understood that knowledge could be lost, that memory was fragile, that survival needed saving not just of food and tools, but of information itself. This is not to say that local Mesopotamian populations contributed nothing. Sumer was not built by Europeans transplanting their culture completely into foreign land. It was built by a blend refugees bringing organizational knowledge and technological frameworks, local populations contributing farming skills and environmental understanding, and a mixing of both creating something never seen before. But the refugee contribution explains what local development alone cannot: the speed, the skill, and the appearance of fully working systems with no visible learning curve. The timelines cross at 6200 BC. The genetics confirm European or Eastern mixing during the exact period when Doggerland was destroyed. The material culture shows technological movement along the migration route. The mythology saves memory of the disaster on both ends of the journey. And the urban development. And Sumer reflects exactly the kind of knowledge that displaced memory-bearing populations would carry and put in place. Each line of evidence looked at alone can't be questioned. But when they come together, when 5 independent data streams all point to the same conclusion, the probability shifts from guessing to likelihood. Doggerland drowned. Its people fled. They carried their knowledge across 2,000 years and 3,000 miles. And when they finally settled in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, they built cities that would change human history. Doggerland's refugees may have shaped the world's first cities. But what other legacies did they carry into their new lives? Memory shapes behavior in ways that last longer than the events themselves. Trauma, especially group trauma, leaves marks that continue across generations, not just as stories told around fires, but as deep cultural instincts about what matters, what threatens, and what must be saved at all costs. If the first Sumerians included descendants of Doggerland's refugees, then they were not simply people who had moved from one place to another. They were survivors of a world that had betrayed them, people whose ancestors had watched everything familiar disappear beneath water in a single terrible day, people who carried that knowledge forward through 2,000 years of migration, adaptation, and uncertainty. And when they finally settled in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, when they finally stopped moving and began building something permanent, the memory of what they had lost shaped every choice they made. Consider water. For most farming societies, water is simply a resource, something to manage, certainly, but not a life or death threat. Rivers flood predictably. Rain follows seasonal patterns. You learn the cycles, adapt your farming to match, and accept occasional bad years as part of life's rhythm. But for populations descended from people who watched the sea destroy their entire world, water would never be just a resource. It would be a force that needed constant watching, complete control, and engineering solutions that left nothing to chance. The Sumerian approach to water management reflects this mindset. Their irrigation systems were not small actions, simple channels cut to redirect river water. They were complete water infrastructures designed to master water totally. Canals stretched for miles. Levees controlled flooding with exactness. Drainage systems prevented waterlogging. Basin irrigation gave out water in carefully measured amounts. This is not the work of farmers carefully testing new techniques. This is the work of people who understood water as both necessity and enemy, who knew from passed-down experience that survival meant never being at water's mercy again. The archaeological record shows that these systems appeared working from the beginning. There is no development sequence of failures and improvements. The earliest irrigation we can record is already advanced, already successful. This makes sense if the knowledge was not being invented but applied, adapted from understanding built up across generations of watching, learning, and remembering what water could do. The same pattern appears in Sumerian resource management. The accounting systems recorded in early cuneiform tablets are very complex. They track grain stores down to exact amounts. They record labor assignments with careful detail. They watch livestock inventories, tool distributions, and raw material allocations with an obsessive thoroughness that seems too much for small farming communities. Why such detailed record-keeping? Because when you are descended from people who lost everything, who fled with only what they could carry, who survived by carefully rationing resources across uncertain journeys, you never assume plenty will last. You count, you measure, you save not because you are naturally curious, but because you remember, culturally and instinctively, what it means to have nothing. The earliest Sumerian accounting tablets show this mindset. They are not casual records. They are detailed inventories suggesting a worldview where tracking resources is not excessive paperwork, but survival necessity, where knowing exactly what you have, exactly what you owe, and exactly what you can afford to give out, is not optional but basic to security. This is the mindset of people who have learned through disaster that the world can change in an instant. City building itself may show similar instincts. Hunter-gatherer societies usually avoid putting populations in single locations. It increases disease risk, strains local resources, and makes communities open to local disasters. Spreading out offers strength, but Sumer chose putting people together, not just villages, but cities, groups of tens of thousands of people living close together, dependent on shared systems and organized labor. This choice makes more sense if seen through the lens of trauma. Scattered populations are hard to defend, hard to organize, and open to isolation. When disaster strikes, when floods come, when invaders attack, when resources fail, spread out communities face threats alone. But group populations can combine resources, organize defense, coordinate responses, and give mutual support. Cities are not just economic or management conveniences. They are security solutions. They represent the group decision that survival needs staying together, that the risks of spreading out outweigh the risks of grouping together. For populations descended from refugees who survived by keeping community unity across 2,000 years of migration, city building would feel not like innovation, but like common sense. You build close together. You organize centrally. You create systems that bind people into mutually dependent networks because you remember. Again, culturally, what happens when communities break apart under pressure? And then there are the temples. The ziggurat, Sumer's most famous building form, appears fully developed by the time of Uruk. These were not small shrines that slowly grew into larger structures. They were huge platforms towering above the flat Mesopotamian landscape, needing enormous labor and resources to build. Why build them? The standard interpretation is religious temples as houses for gods, ziggurats, as artificial mountains connecting earth to heaven. This is definitely part of the answer. But there may be another layer. For people whose world was destroyed by forces beyond human control, by rising seas, by tsunamis, by climate disasters, understanding the cosmos becomes a survival need. If the gods can destroy worlds, then keeping right relationship with those gods is not spiritual luxury but practical necessity. Temple building is reassurance. It is humanity saying that we understand cosmic order, that we take part in it correctly, that we have done what is needed to prevent the next disaster. The ziggurat's height, its visibility across huge distances, broadcasts this message: we are in balance with the powers that control existence. We have built correctly. We are safe. This is guessing, of course. We cannot read the minds of ancient builders. But we can see that societies experiencing group trauma often develop detailed rituals and monuments designed to prevent it happening again. The temples of Sumer may have been built not just to honor gods, but to reassure communities, descendants of survivors, that this time they had done everything necessary to make sure the world would not drown again. The writing system deserves special attention in this setting. Writing appears in Sumer around 3200 BC, coming out not slowly, but as a working tool for recording complex information. The early established record economic deals, grain stores, livestock counts, labor assignments. But writing is more than paperwork technology. It is memory made permanent. Oral tradition is powerful but is also fragile. Stories change with each telling. Knowledge gets lost when specialists die. Cultural information fades across generations, especially in populations experiencing repeated moving and social disruption. Writing solves this. It fixes knowledge in physical form that survives individual deaths, that can be copied and saved, that resists the wearing away of memory across time. For populations descended from people who lost their homeland, who spent thousands of years moving through unfamiliar landscapes where old certainties no longer worked, writing would represent more than convenience. It would represent security, the ability to save knowledge permanently, to make sure that what was learned through terrible experience would never be forgotten, never be lost when the last person who remembered it died. The fact that Sumerian writing appears mature rather than experimental suggests it came from populations who already understood why permanent record-keeping mattered, not people learning slowly that writing might be useful, but people putting in place a solution to a problem they had inherited: how to save knowledge in a world where nothing else has survived whole. The astronomical knowledge built into Sumerian text strengthens this understanding. The Sumerians tracked sky cycles with exactness, calculated lunar months, predicted planetary movements, and developed math systems for modeling cosmic patterns. This level of skill needs generations of careful observation. You cannot predict sky cycles without watching the sky carefully over long periods, recording patterns, and testing models against seen reality. But if Doggerland refugees spent 2,000 years moving across continents, they would have needed exactly this knowledge. Moving populations track seasons through sky markers. They navigate by stars. They time migrations, plantings, and harvests by watching the sky. Knowledge builds up not because of abstract scientific curiosity, but because survival depends on it. By the time their descendants settled in Mesopotamia, they would have carried centuries of built-up astronomical understanding not written in texts, which would not survive the journey, but coded in cultural practice, passed down through generations of sky watchers who taught the next generation how to read the cosmos. When that knowledge finally found form in writing, it appeared mature because it was mature. It was not being invented in Sumer. It was being recorded there for the first time. What comes out then is a picture of Sumerian civilization shaped basically by memory, by the passed-down mental mark of disaster experienced generations. Before but never forgotten, never overcome, never allowed to fade into unimportance. Every major innovation of Sumerian culture can be read through this view. Control water completely, because water destroyed our ancestors' world. Count every resource carefully, because we know what it means to have nothing. Build cities where people can protect each other, because spreading out means weakness. Build temples to keep cosmic order, because disorder brought flood and darkness. Write everything down, because oral memory is fragile and knowledge can be lost. Watch the sky constantly, because understanding the cosmos helps us survive it. This is not to suggest that Sumer was built only by hurt refugees. Local Mesopotamian populations contributed hugely. Farming techniques, environmental knowledge, cultural traditions that merged with those of the newcomers. Sumerian civilization was a blend, not a transplant. But the sudden putting in place of skilled systems, the absence of development stages, and the particular character of Sumerian innovations all suggest that the refugee contribution gave something crucial: a framework of passed-down knowledge refined by necessity, organizational structures tested across migrations, and cultural memory that understood what civilizations needed because it remembered what happened when civilizations failed. The effects reached beyond Doggerland and Sumer. The freezing seas destroyed a thriving Mesolithic culture in northern Europe, and its survivors carried knowledge that helped shape the world's first cities. Then the question becomes, how many other drowned worlds lie beneath today's oceans? How many other coastlines flooded during the same period of post-ice age sea level rise, had advanced populations whose descendants we can no longer trace? The Persian Gulf was once a fertile river valley before flooding turned it into a shallow sea. The sunless shelf between Southeast Asia and Indonesia was dry land connecting mainland to islands. The coasts of India, China, and the Americas all changed dramatically as seas rose. Populations living on those drowned coasts would have faced the same pressures as Doggerland's people. Some would have died. Some would have fled inland, carrying their knowledge into new regions, shaping the development of cultures that history remembers as native innovations, but which may have been partly reconstructions by survivors. We cannot know how many times this pattern has repeated. We can only recognize that it happened at least once in a way we can trace, connecting a drowned world beneath the North Sea to the first cities of Mesopotamia. And if it happened once, the rule stands. Human civilization is not a simple straight line from primitive to advanced. It is a story written over and over by survivors, people who carried memory through disaster, who adapted and saved and rebuilt, who refused to let knowledge die even when worlds drowned. We are all descendants. The survivors. The cities we live in, the technologies we use, the stories we tell, all of them rest on foundations laid by people who remembered what came before, who carried that memory forward through disaster, who built again, knowing that nothing is permanent, but determined to build anyway. If Doggerland's people helped build the world's first cities, then the story of civilization is not the story of one beginning, but of a beginning built on the memory of an ending.